And now I would like to introduce our next plenary speaker, which I have also the pleasure to introduce, and that's Lydia X. Brown. Lydia X. Brown is an advocate, organizer, educator, attorney, strategist, and writer. Their work focuses on addressing state and interpersonal violence targeting disabled people living at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nation. We're grateful to have Lydia here today. Lydia modeled for us the importance of having good work-life balance by taking yesterday off to celebrate their birthday. So happy birthday, Lydia, and welcome. Now we'd love to hear from you.
This is Lydia, sign name L. Brown. Pronouns they, them, or ella in Espanol. I'm a young with short black hair and glasses. Also, there's now blue in my hair too. I'm wearing a green shirt against a blue background for Valor's National Sexual Assault Conference. I want to begin with an invitation and an invocation. I begin every facilitation, every talk, every workshop the same way. This is an invitation to each of you to take a moment of pause and grounding, to listen and tune in to what your body-mind is telling you about what it is that it needs, that it craves, that it desires. This is an invitation to you to consider what it is that your body-mind is offering, is asking for. This is an invitation to you to consider whether you've had something to eat or drink in the last couple hours, if you need to nourish yourself, if you need to attend to thirst, to ask what it is that you've carried with you into this space today. Have you carried with you into this space your anger, your righteous indignation, the rage of generations to come and ancestors and elders before us? Have you carried into this space your grief, your sorrow, your mourning? Have you carried into this space your exhaustion, your bone weariness, your annoyances, your frustrations, your anxieties? Have you carried with you into this space your joy, your gratitude, your appreciation, your eager anticipation, your acceptance, your sense of validation? What is it that you've carried with you into the space that we share today? We are often expected, particularly in a quote unquote professional context, or even and especially in many advocacy, activist, and organized contexts, to check our bodies and brains at the door, not to bring our whole selves to be present, not to be allowed to have feelings and frailties and needs and precarities. This is an invitation for us to tune in to what our body, minds, in fact need. It is they're calling for us to understand. I'm going to pause and give us all that moment to tune in and listen to our body, minds, to ask each of us to take that moment of grounding. Sometimes people like to close their eyes for this, are welcome to do that, although certainly not required. Let us all take that moment of pause now. Thank you for doing that with me. I give that invitation in every space because it is a micro practice of disability justice, to invite us to attend to our bodily, mind, and needs, to remind us that for those of us who do not currently have the resources, space, or the structure or the support to meet our needs, that is not a reflection of our worth or our value, but rather a reminder to all of us that all of our needs are worth fighting for, that all of us are worth it, that we deserve it, that it is our obligation to fight for, to build, and to sustain a world, communities, spaces, and practices that allow and enable each of us to have our needs met. And for those of us that do have access to the resources, the space, the structures, and the support necessary to meet our needs, then it is a reminder to us that our needs deserve to be met. We are not wrong or burdensome or broken for having needs or for choosing to meet them. That it does not make us a problem, that we are not the problem to be solved, to be managed. Disability justice teaches us that all of our body minds are valuable and worthy and desirable. Disability justice teaches us that all of us have needs and that our needs deserve to be met. That chief among our needs for each of us are the needs for care, the needs for access, the need for freedom, the need for justice. That disability justice reminds us that there is no person whose humanity is conditional, that there is no person whose humanity must be earned, whose personhood is merely optional or potential, but never fully realized, achieved, or recognized. Disability justice helps us to understand and to carve out a vision for what it is we are fighting for, why it is we are telling our stories, what it means that we are transforming toward or into when we talk about transformative justice. What are we working and fighting for? What are we moving toward? Disability justice is a set of principles, practice, guiding vision, futurity. It is world making. It is sustenance. Disability justice itself as a framework was created just within the last 15 years by a collective of queer and trans disabled people and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color within the disabled community, and particularly queer and trans disabled people of color. And disability justice framework was created as a direct response to an expansion upon the limiting frameworks of rights, of equity, of inclusion, or of equality. To recognize and to understand that when we talk about disability oppression, when we talk about ableism, the system of power differentials and power relations that teaches us that only some body minds are whole, healthy, well, and deserving, that other body minds are expendable, disposable, less than human, or not human, that system of ableism wends its way through, is necessary for, and dependent upon every other form of oppression with which we contend. Ableism is the bedrock that undergirds settler colonialism and imperialism. It is the foundation for racialized capitalism. It is necessary for and deeply embedded within white supremacy and racism. It powers and it sustains queer antagonism and trans antagonism and misogyny. Disability oppression or ableism is necessary for and arises out of every other form of oppression that we face. The violence of ableism at the individual level and at the systemic level represents and wends its way through the violences of land, of linguistic genocide, of sexual violence, of violence within the family, the violence of the academy, the violence of the medical system, the violence of our scientific research, the violence of the state, the violence of empire and militarization. Ableism is not possible to understand without a deliberately intersectional analysis, without building intersectionally, without organizing intersectionally, and without analyzing intersectionally. Whether we are looking at the history of the way in which ableism has always been used in this nation to justify the enslavement of Black Africans and their descendants, the ways in which ableist rhetorics and logic were used to justify and to further land theft and linguistic and cultural genocide of Native peoples, tribal nations throughout the land that is currently labeled illegitimately as the United States, the ways in which ableism has always been used to justify the existence of immigration quotas, of determining which immigrants are valuable based upon perceived notions, racistly and ableistly, of wealth, of intelligence, of contribution. The ways in which ableism has always been used to justify mass criminalization and mass incarceration, the ways in which disability incarceration and incarceration cannot be separated or understood as separate or isolated from one another. The ways in which ableism justifies the ways in which children are dehumanized, the ways in which our elders are dehumanized, the ways that ableism justifies, pervades, and upholds regime sexual terror and violence within the family, within partnerships, within society, and because of the state. The ways in which sexual violence and carceral violence are inseparable and deeply entangled. Ableism requires us to understand how it operates, but it does not want us to, because oppression works by rendering deliberately invisible its mechanics, by incentivizing us to think of it as individual, so that we do not have a vision to work for or toward. Oppression wants us to think only about what we can do just to make the pain stop, and not what we want after. Oppression wants us to think that if we have a better attitude, that if we get better grants, that if we can form the correct coalitions and partnerships with institutions where power is concentrated, where the people who hold power remain wealth privileged, Christian, heterosexual, white, male, educated, Western, and in the global North, so that we can then attain some measure of, however temporary or contingent, respectability, some measure of approximation of power, of dominance, of normality, some measure of assimilation, all of which still gives us only the promise of conditional or potential personhood. Then perhaps oppression and violence will lessen. It does not want us to think about the systems and the structures that perpetuate and uphold its violence. It does not want us to think about the 80 to 90% of developmentally disabled people who've been assaulted at least once in our lifetimes, nor the fact that more than half of those that are designated female at birth, that's the way the statistics are collected, none of it is inclusive of or centering, let alone led by trans people, that the more than half of those who are designated female at birth will be sexually assaulted at least 18 times by the age of 18, that we are over the course of our lifetimes at least 7 times more likely to be assaulted than those who are not disabled, and that if we think about the intersections for those of us who are queer, who are trans, who are impoverished, who are immigrants or refugees from BIPOC communities, in rural communities, in the global South, living in occupied, living in colonized lands and territories, that our communities likely face much higher rates of sexual violence at every turn. There are people in my community who I know who literally measure time based in increments of time since last assault, because that is the only way to think about time. Ableism does not want us to think about what it means to move past that, to understand the connections between carceral violence, medical violence, reproductive violence, colonial violence, and ableist violence. But disability justice asks us to think, what would it mean for us to build, sustain, and live in a world where we all receive care, where violence prevention means changing and transforming our cultures and our societies, where violence prevention means ending and abolishing the police and prison systems that enact and perpetuate violence while protecting the perpetrators of it. Disability justice asks us to think what violence prevention means, what survivor-centric and survivor-led movements mean when so many perpetrators of violence, so many people who harm, and so many people who abuse are also survivors. You see, disability justice is messy, disability justice is hard, and yet it is also easy. Disability justice is a commitment to care and access as radical praxis. Disability justice is an understanding that justice itself requires radical and active love. Disability justice is an offering that reminds us that if none of us are expendable or disposable, that all of our needs are valid and deserve to be met, that all of us are valuable and worthy, then that means all of us. What is the future we are building for? What can we imagine as worthwhile if we think about a future that feels impossibly far away and yet is just over the horizon. It's coming now, so close we can almost smell it, so close its presence can make us tremble because we feel it coming, because we are building it, because we demand it, because we want it, because we are working toward it. What will come? In the morning, when we wake, in the world where violence is no longer our reality and the fabric of our existence, in the world where violence is no longer inevitable, in the world where systems and structures of violence do not exist, where all of us are held with love and care, where we all have access, where we all have support, where we are valued as individual people, able to live authentically and able to live in community, in respecting our sacred obligations, in living in right relationship with one another, with the land that we inhabit, with the stewards and original inhabitants of the lands where we live and work. In the world in which we are valued, the world in which the violence that we work on now, the violence that we contend with is but history. What does the world look like? What do we hear around us? What do we witness? What do we receive? What does it feel like to be cared for? What does justice look like for us past violence, past carceral, already violent, failed systems? What does justice look like when justice is defined as love and as access? What does justice look like when it is defined as worth and for all of us? What does justice look like when it is defined by those who have always been most impacted by deprivation and exploitation? What does justice look like when we create it?